Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's January 13th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Happy New Year to all of our listeners out there, whether you're a Manga Bay Newscast diehard or a first-time listener. Due to the COVID pandemic, 2020 was a rough year for just about everyone, and the world's tropical forests experienced their share of hardship as well, thanks to impacts of the pandemic, wildfires, ongoing deforestation, and increasing threats to environmental land defenders. Since this is our first episode of 2021, we're taking this opportunity to look at some of the most important trends and issues that will be affecting rainforest conservation in the coming year, and the reasons to have hope that things can and will get better. Joining us today is Manga Bay founder and CEO Rhett Butler. Every year for the past decade plus, Rhett has written a Rainforest Year in Review piece, and since 2017, he's also posted a What to Watch in the Year Ahead piece. Because you can't understand where rainforests might be headed in 2021 without understanding how they fared in 2020, Rhett is on the show today to discuss his most recent Rainforest Year in Review and the major storylines to watch over the coming year. We're also joined by Joe Eisen, the executive director of the NGO Rainforest Foundation Uk. Eisen gives us his take on the year that was, and helps us dive more deeply into the major issues and events likely to impact Africa's tropical forests over the course of 2021. I asked Manga Bay's Rhett Butler to get things started by telling us what we need to know about 2020 in order to understand where we're at heading into 2021.
2020 was a pretty rough year for tropical forests. So the headline numbers are that there was a significant increase in deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, which is the world's largest rainforest. I think a bigger problem is that the groundwork was laid for deforestation to continue increasing in Brazil, but also Indonesia. So we may have not seen the full impact of what went down in 2020 actually in 2020.
The types of policies that Rhett's referring to, such as incentives for agro-industrial expansion and the relaxation of environmental laws, typically lead to higher deforestation rates, he says, but we don't actually have good satellite data yet to tell us exactly what happened in 2020.
So we kind of have to rely on the proxy data. I would expect the satellite data to be, processed and analyzed in the next quarter. So we'll be able to sort of look back and assess it. But in terms of beyond, what happened in Brazil and some of the policy developments, there was a significant increase in the price of most commodities that are associated with deforestation. So typically when you see an appreciation in, the price of palm oil and things like that, it sends a signal to producers to expand operations and, produce more of that commodity. And so the fact that the price has increased should encourage more deforestation in the future. Broadly put, COVID was not necessarily beneficial to forests in reducing pressure based off of sort of the proxy data that we've seen so far.
That seems like a particularly important point because when lockdowns really got underway across the globe, you started to see air pollution rates going down in cities, for instance, among other beneficial impacts of the decreased human activity. It even spawned a million internet memes about nature as healing. But ultimately, the COVID pandemic didn't really lead to a meaningful downturn in the types of activities that negatively impact tropical forests?
Yeah, so I think there was a temporary situation where you saw emissions fall, the skies cleared, but I think that was important. So I think what it did is it made a lot of people aware of just how bad things had gotten. And if we look at what happened in Beijing around the 2008 Olympics, the governments, wanted to have clear skies for the Olympics. And so they shut down a bunch of, heavy industries. They restricted, what days people could drive their cars. And it led to this dramatic clearing of the skies. And after the Olympics, there was sort of a return to business as usual, but people really did not like that. And so there was then public pressure, even in a place like China, which led to sort of these long-term changes so that now Beijing is not among the 100 most polluted cities in the world. So people got used to having clean air, and when it went back to being dirty air, they didn't like that. So I think in terms of sort of our urban pollution and issues like that, that will be the case. The problem for tropical forests is most people don't live in tropical forests and they're still kind of far away. And so the changes there, especially, like commodity-driven deforestation, it's not something where just the sky is clear. It's, these forests are being chopped away for large-scale agriculture and cattle ranching and things like that. So it's a little bit out of direct sort of day-to-day of the average person. So they're not really experiencing it firsthand. So I think the change that might have long-term implications for forests is recognizing how planetary health is connected with human health. And so the idea that if these ecosystems that provide critical services for humanity are degraded, that leads to adverse outcomes for people. So COVID is a zoonotic disease. It came from some wildlife population that then transferred through various vectors into humans, and it causes horrible pandemic. And so people are sort of aware of this connection to nature and biodiversity. And so, my hope is that people don't forget that, and it leads to greater awareness of the need to maintain ecosystems as being healthy and productive.
Another fairly big impact of COVID would be that 2020 was meant to be a major inflection point of sorts in rainforest conservation. It was the target year for meeting the goals of a number of international agreements and corporate commitments, things like that. So last year should have been a year of taking stock of the past decade and setting new goals for the future. But a lot of those kinds of meetings just didn't happen, right?
Yeah, so exactly. So 2020 was a year where governments were committing to sort of assess what happened over the past decade and then set the agenda for the next decade, both on climate change, but also addressing the biodiversity loss, extinction crisis. And those meetings were mostly postponed, some were canceled. And so it led everything to be delayed for, at least a year. Some of the reports that were associated with those meetings still came out. So that was significant. But the other thing that happened was a lot of these corporate commitments, especially around zero deforestation, you tend to get, bigger commitments and solid action around these meetings. And, the reality is that a lot of companies were struggling to actually implement those policies after making those commitments, and they didn't really make that much progress this year. And there wasn't sort of this pressure from a New York Declaration on Forest meeting or like a COP.
That's a conference of the parties to international agreement.
Things like that might have kind of lit a fire under those efforts. And so NGOs did their year-end assessment and basically said a lot of these companies are way behind on actually meeting these commitments they made.
So last time we had you on the podcast was in May of last year to talk about the upcoming fire season. That was just as Australia's fire season was ending, which was particularly devastating last year. But the world's major tropical forests were just about to enter theirs. How did the fire season turn out in the world's major rainforests last year?
So fires were bad again in the Amazon. So that was both the Brazilian Amazon and the Bolivian Amazon. Well above sort of the average for the past 20 years or past 10 years in that region. The fires that were feared for Indonesia didn't materialize as much as expected. And that was because we shifted into more La Nina conditions, which result in wetter, more rainfall across much of Indonesia. And so that helped reduce the spread of fires. And so that was very important. And that the La Nina should carry well into this year. And so that may suppress fire activity both in places like Borneo and Sumatra, but also the Amazon, especially kind of the eastern Amazon, northern Brazil.
So obviously the COVID pandemic is going to be a major storyline in 2021, just as it was probably the single biggest factor in 2020. What's at stake for rainforests as countries try to rebound from the impacts of the pandemic?
So the COVID pandemic is definitely going to loom very large for rainforests this year. And it will probably be a lot around the economic recovery. And so countries like Brazil and Indonesia have passed economic stimulus measures that, on the face of it could become major drivers of deforestation and essentially lock in deforestation for decades to come. So in Indonesia, what that looks like is last year there was a deregulation bill that was passed into law. It was best known as the Omnibus Bill. And so what that did is it removed a lot of the environmental laws around establishing industrial plantations and doing mining. So that's going to make it easier for those sorts of companies to move into forest areas and peatlands and convert them for extractive activities and industrial agriculture. The second big thing in Indonesia, which I think you could argue is a stimulus package, is a food estate program and a biofuels mandate. And so the food estate program and the biofuels mandate together basically provide, I guess you just say, are going to be huge drivers of deforestation, because essentially what they're doing is they're opening up millions of hectares of forest and peatlands to large-scale plantations. So, just for example, the biofuel mandate alone could open an area that's about could require an area of new oil palm plantations that's a fifth the size of the island of Borneo. The other thing that's happening with that biodiesel mandate is it will create a huge source of demand for palm oil that doesn't necessarily need to meet the international standards for avoiding deforestation or human rights abuses. So essentially what it could do is undermine those corporate zero deforestation policies. So those corporate policies and also some government policies, they would still apply, but there's going to be a huge source of demand for palm oil that doesn't meet that standard. And so, potentially it's going to create like a price floor for palm oil and just this, huge source of demand into the future. And kind of the irony of what's happening in Indonesia is that the Joko administration has been trying to position the country as a place for electric vehicle production. And so the fact that they're sort of doubling down on biofuels kind of goes against the whole idea of moving to EVs. On the Brazil front, it's similar. So there's been the Bolsonaro administration's been, even before COVID, was basically dismantling environmental laws, reducing law enforcement, and pushing through infrastructure projects, and just kind of generally eviscerating the agencies that manage natural resources. And so all of that has gotten worse with the pandemic. And so, that's not really a good sign for the Amazon, especially as there's more and more evidence coming in of the long-term damage that's been done to the ecosystem. So both through deforestation, degradation, and climate change. And so, there's growing evidence of the ecosystem shifting towards a drier forest habitat. And scientists have warned that large parts of the Amazon can eventually tip towards a woody savanna-like ecosystem, which would have huge impacts for carbon storage, for fire regimes, for biodiversity, for water provisioning. So the stakes are pretty high. If we lock in long-term deforestation of the Brazilian Amazon, the likelihood of large parts of that ecosystem transforming from rainforest to savanna really increases.
In the year in review piece you published on Manga Bay that last year the Amazon had its highest level of deforestation since 2008.
Yeah, so last year deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon topped 11,000 square kilometers, which was the highest since 2008. And the year before it had topped 10,000 square kilometers, which previously had been the highest since 2008. So we're moving back into sort of a high deforestation regime for the Brazilian Amazon, which is a reversal of the trend between the mid 2000s and the early 2010s, where there was this very large decline in annual deforestation in the region.
So the drying out of tropical forests like the Amazon is expected to continue, but the La Nina event that started last year, you say will continue through 2021 and possibly bring some relief?
Yeah, so La Nina in 2021 should reduce the likelihood of fires starting and also burning into forest areas. So it should dampen the extent of fires in Indonesia and Brazil. That said, it's really pretty superficial, because the groundwork was laid last year in the form of these policies for expanded deforestation. So, we might get this temporary reprieve, but there's no reason to expect that it's going to change this trend of rising deforestation. I mean, especially in Brazil. So again, we may see a short-term benefit from La Nina, but I don't think it will represent a major shift in reversing this new rising deforestation trend.
As you said, scientists have been warning that the Amazon might be approaching a tipping point for quite a while now, but you also mentioned in your article that we're seeing some of the same drying trends in Africa's tropical forests and also in Southeast Asia. Is that just in Indonesia or elsewhere?
Yeah, so it would be elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So, there are reports of drying trends in parts of the Mekong region. That's probably more likely related to deforestation and land use change rather than climate change. But, it has been observed there. And certainly in the Congo Basin, there's evidence of a drying trend. And there have also been some major fires actually, in the forest. So the Central African, West African region historically has a lot of small agricultural fires. The difference is that in the past few years, we've seen some mega fires burning through what are typically pretty heavily forested areas, and so that's concerning. And then also just this long-term drying trend. Congo Basin didn't get a lot of coverage in my 11 things to watch for 2021, reason for that was I didn't see a major catalyst for a shift in 2021 in the Congo Basin. I mean, there are a few things that could be significant, but I have to I drew the line 11, and so some things don't make it in there. But there are. I didn't mean to overlook the Congo Basin. There was a reason why it wasn't included. Just that I didn't see those near term catalysts. But it is the world's second largest rainforest region, and it's critically important in terms of sustaining local livelihoods, mitigating climate change, and obviously the biodiversity. So it got more coverage in the year-end wrap-up for 2020.
Yeah, and that's, of course, why we'll be speaking with Joe Eisen of Rainforest Foundation UK next to dig a bit deeper into the major issues to watch regarding Africa's rainforests throughout the coming year. So how do you think the incoming Biden administration in the U.S. and the fact that, as we now know, Democrats will control both houses of Congress will likely play into rainforests' fate in 2021?
The political changes in the U.S. are really important for forests and other ecosystems. I mean, I think at the highest level, the U.S. is more likely to sign on to international agreements that are trying to mitigate climate change and meet biodiversity targets. The other thing that's, I think, often overlooked is the U.S. is seen as being a leader on these issues in many countries. And the last 4 years, the U.S. has not been a leader in these areas. And so the U.S. returning to sort of that role is very important. And I think one way to look at this is the U.S. has historically invested a lot of money in things like endangered species policy and creating protected areas. And other countries will build their own policies off of U.S. policy. And so when we eliminate those policies or weaken those policies, then that can have knock-on effects in other countries. And so, returning to a leadership position is very important. I think another area where the U.S. will potentially have a influence that goes beyond just domestic side of things is around developing a model for greener economic development. So the Biden administration has pledged up to $2 trillion for economic recovery that's essentially greener. And, that can create all sorts of benefits in terms of, reducing improving technological innovation in terms of, making renewable energy more productive. When you're doing things at large scale, you can create efficiencies, around these certain, again, renewable energy or other areas. I also think that it could be interesting to look at something like what happened under the New Deal with Roosevelt, with the Civilian Conservation Corps, where large numbers of people were employed, essentially creating our national park system. So whether there's opportunities for green jobs that are part of the economic recovery. So again, I think all of that is going to be really important, both domestically, but also internationally, in terms of providing examples and actually building back better, as the Biden administration says.
You also identify some of these government-to-government carbon deals as something to watch this year. Can you give us a couple of the major examples of these deals and tell us why you think there might be more of them this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something interesting to watch, these government-to-government carbon deals. I mean, I think that they will raise a lot of questions, and that's really important for forest conservation. So one of these deals signed last year was between the governments of Switzerland and Peru, which is essentially like a carbon offset deal under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And so under this agreement, Switzerland will effectively get carbon credits that are generated by financing various activities and projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Peru. So that could be things, like avoided deforestation, carbon conservation projects. The second thing that I mentioned was Norway increasing the price they're paying for avoided carbon emissions for its tropical forest funding initiative. So that means that countries like Gabon will get, instead of getting $5 per ton, they'll get $10 per ton, which again is well below the price that economists say we should be paying for carbon, but it still represents a doubling of what the baseline was. And so again, I think that the fact that more of these deals will start to happen will show that there are sort of market-based there is interest in market-based mechanisms for protecting forests. That said, there's a lot of disagreement in terms of that approach, and so I think another byproduct of this will be a lot of conversation about the various issues involved with carbon offsetting. And so I think we'll see just a lot more discussion on that. So I think if you look at back in the 2000s, late 2000s, when Redd was becoming a big, I guess, first entering on the scene.
Rhett is the UN's program for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation.
One of the byproducts of the whole emergence of Redd was this huge increase in awareness around the issue of informed consent among Indigenous peoples and local communities. And then the idea that Indigenous and local communities have this major role as stewards of tropical forests. And so they need to be part of the conversation. So a lot of the early criticism around Redd was around consent and involvement of these communities. And what happened in the 2010s was a huge increase in NGOs that were focused on things like securing land tenure and securing land rights. And so I think it was a very productive byproduct of the emergence of Redd was bringing those issues to the fore. And so I think you could see something similar with what happens with these government-to-government carbon deals. Like those issues will just continue to get more important.
Norway is funding new satellite monitoring in 2021. What kind of impact do you expect that to have?
So last year, the Norwegian government funded 3 satellite monitoring companies to provide free access to their high-resolution satellite imagery in the tropics. So it's not necessarily new technology. I mean, technology is always advancing in this space, but it's funding the availability of the free availability of this data. So what that means is that NGOs, local governments, law enforcement, researchers can now all access this, in some cases, near real-time satellite imagery and data on tropical forests. And so this could be really transformational in terms of understanding what's driving deforestation and where it's occurring on a time frame where action is actually possible to address it. So you still have to deal with issues like political will and whatnot, but the data is just going to get much better, and so we'll have a much clearer picture of what's actually happening on the ground. And in terms of Mongabey's work, we rely very heavily on satellite data, and typically we're dealing with at least a few week delay, sometimes a few months. And the fact that these various platforms are now going to have Global Forest Watch data, now going to have this data from these different platforms. So like Global Forest Watch, for example, we'll be able to process that data and provide it on a much more timely basis. And so that will enable our journalists to do better reporting on what's happening on the ground. So again, I think that the Norway providing this satellite data or making the satellite data available is potentially transformational for monitoring forests.
Throughout the 2010s, voluntary zero deforestation commitments by companies were a major focus, but you expect that the focus will now shift to government mandates?
In the late 2000s, there was the emergence of this thing called the Zero Deforestation Commitment. And then in the 2010s, a lot of companies started signing up for this. And so the whole idea is that a company commits to zero deforestation, no peatlands conversion, and no human exploitations in its supply chain for tropical commodities that they source. And so, again, these really took off in the 2010s, but the first generation of these were really just commitments. So it was one thing to make a commitment, it was another thing to implement these policies. And it turns out that companies are finding implementing these policies a lot more difficult than they thought. And so a lot of companies are just very far behind on what they promised. And there's been several reports that have, confirmed this. And so the fact that companies aren't providing the leadership that they committed to, combined with governments that are becoming more ambitious in their climate commitments, means that I think we'll see a shift from voluntary efforts to government mandated compliance with zero deforestation. And so last year we started to see some significant developments on this front. For example, the UK government proposed a law, which it hasn't gone into effect yet or anything, but it's seeking feedback on it, where large companies that operate in the country would be liable for commodities produced through deforestation. France has pledged to ban what they call deforestation imports by 2030, and in fact said that it was going to stop importing soy from Brazil due to deforestation. And then, again, this didn't pass, but in November, voters in Switzerland very narrowly rejected something that was called the Responsible Business Initiative, which would have held Swiss companies financially and legally liable for human rights violations or environmental damage, even when it occurs overseas. So that means that if Nestle was sourcing cacao, let's say from West Africa, that was produced via deforestation or enslaved children, they could be held liable in Swiss court. Again, voters narrowly rejected that. They actually voters voted actually approved the measure than disapproved. But the way that voting works in Switzerland was a little bit like the U.S. Electoral College. So it meant that it was the number of subnational entities that vote one way or the other that determine the fate of the initiative. But basically, more people in Switzerland said yes than no to this initiative. So again, it failed, but I think we'll start to see more laws like that, which essentially put the onus of compliance with zero deforestation commitments on companies, and there will be legal consequences or financial consequences if they do not eliminate deforestation from their supply chain. So I think that that's very significant. On the U.S. front, I think you're more likely to see action at the subnational level. So I know that there have been some jurisdictions in California that have proposed essentially what are zero deforestation commitments for government procurement of certain commodities or products. I think the U.S. is just a different regulatory framework, so it's hard to envision, like a national level zero deforestation policy. But I could envision some more regulation around that. And I mean, just at the very end of the year, for example, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection started blocking palm oil products from Sime Darby, which is Malaysia's national palm oil company, due to allegations of forced labor on its plantations. And so that was a very interesting thing to see. I don't know where it will go, but it was definitely a notable development.
Environmental defenders have been facing grave threats of violence and criminalization over the past several years. Do things like the Escazú Agreement in Latin America and the global protests against racial inequality give you any hope that we might see the tide sort of turn against this trend this year?
I would be surprised if it changed in 2021 because we're already in 2021, and sort of the dynamics of the past year have been pretty bad for environmental defenders. And so I think COVID and pandemic lockdowns have just made it very difficult for any sort of protest or sort of dissent in many countries that are, important forest countries. I think it's going to just continue to be open season on environmental defenders, unfortunately. And so I do think that the agreement in Latin America is important. The thing is, there's only a few countries have signed it, and there's going to be a lot of opposition in some of the most important countries on that, on issues around human rights. So I think it's important, but I don't think it's not going to be like a silver bullet to addressing the issue. So unfortunately, I think we're going to still see a lot of violence and sort of the chronic offenders in terms of places where a lot of environmental defenders get killed. So places like Brazil, Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, Peru. It's hard for me to see a near-term catalyst for really changing that situation. And the fact that commodity prices are rising, it just creates more pressure and more conflict, because a lot of those resources are found on lands that are stewarded by indigenous peoples. And so if you have lack of law enforcement, rising commodity prices, lack of job opportunities, you're going to see a lot of encroachment and illegal activity in indigenous reserves. And I just don't see an easy way to address that in the near term.
For those who aren't familiar, the Escazú Agreement is a legally binding environmental rights agreement signed by at least 24 Latin American countries in 2018 that aims to help prevent and punish attacks against environmental defenders and ensure access to environmental information and decision-making processes. 11 countries have ratified the agreement, meaning it will enter into force this year. You can hear a lot more about the agreement in an episode of the Manga Bay Newscast from last October if you're interested. At the time, it was believed that the agreement would not only be important for Latin America, but also a template for other regions of the world to follow. Is that a possibility?
I think the Escazú Agreement is really important in terms of setting precedent and affecting real change. But I think it's going to take time. Again, it's a small number of countries that have signed on. So more countries we need to sign on Latin America. And then I do think that it could become a blueprint for other regions. So, I mean, I agree with the sentiments expressed in that episode. So it's important. I just don't think that we should expect it to result in major change this particular year. So yeah, I think things like that are definitely needed.
Going into 2021, are there any other reasons to have hope that things will get better for tropical forests?
The past 2 years have been pretty rough for tropical forests, but I just feel it's really important not to lose hope. I mean, Manga Bay tends to focus on a lot of negative developments just by virtue of being a news organization, but there are reasons for hope. And I think it's important not to lose sight of those because in some cases, all we really have is hope. But I mean, just for example, I mean, just to go back to the availability of satellite imagery, that's really important because we will no longer have the excuse of ignorance because we'll see what's happening. So it just becomes of a willingness to take action. Another trend that I think is just really important is the growing recognition of the role indigenous and local communities play in stewarding natural resources. And so the awareness of that has just been growing for the past decade, and it's very encouraging. There's growing body of research that just shows the very significant contributions that are made by these communities to helping mitigate climate change and preserving biodiversity and maintaining ecosystem services that we all depend on. And so again, there are, while there is a lot of negative stuff out there, there are also reasons for hope, and I just hope people don't lose sight of that. I think generally those are some of the key ingredients to why I am still optimistic about forests, despite every day report being involved with reporting on such terrible things that are occurring in forests. And so I just also believe that there's growing recognition of the importance that forests and other natural ecosystems play in maintaining, our current environmental stability. And I think, everything from, like hedge fund managers to people in insurance to, even political leaders can see that it's quite valuable to maintain these ecosystems as healthy and productive than paying for the damage that results when they're destroyed. And so I do think that despite the setback of the past few years on the policy front of the United States, more and more people, organizations, and corporations are really aware of the need for taking action to maintain forests, coral reefs, mangroves as healthy and productive ecosystems.
Joe Eisen, Executive Director of the London-based NGO Rainforest Foundation UK, is here to give us a much more detailed look at the storylines to watch regarding Africa's tropical forests in 2021. But first, I asked him to explain a bit about the group and its work in Africa for those listeners who might not be familiar.
So the Rainforest Foundation was formed in 1989 by the singer Sting. There's actually 3 Rainforest Foundations, one in the US, one in Norway, and one in the UK. We're separate organisations, but we share the same mission, which is about empowering local and indigenous communities to secure and protect their forests. At Rainforest Foundation UK, our geographical areas are the Peruvian Amazon, West Africa, and the Congo Basin. The approach of the Rainforest Foundation is to develop really long-term partnerships with indigenous organisations and national NGOs, and finding new and innovative ways to support greater engagement of forest peoples in forest protection, management, and reform processes. I would say that at RFUK, our work can be divided into 3 streams. The first is how to combat threats to forests and forest people. So, for example, industrial logging and agribusiness expansion and infrastructure development. So, supporting local communities to monitor the impacts of these different sectors on their lives in the forests, and to support them to engage in different processes to hold back some of the worst of these developments. Another stream of our work is what I refer to as looking at full solutions to rainforest loss. And within that, we work really closely with local communities that are impacted by strictly protected areas, and also through the emergence of carbon offsetting schemes, which allow companies and countries in the global north to continue business as usual while placing the burden and onus on local communities with the lowest carbon footprint. The third strand of our work is around solutions. We don't just want to be the NGO on the sidelines saying how bad everything is, but it's about finding the tools and approaches to promote better community empowerment and engagement in the management of tropical rainforests. So one aspect of that is supporting the development of national and international laws that support the rights of local and indigenous communities. Key to this is also the development of enabling technologies which allow communities to play their rightful role. So within that, for example, our Mapping for Rights program is a community mapping program that supported over 1,000 communities to map more than 9 million hectares of forest. So we equip them with smartphone apps, and they collect really incredibly detailed information around their customary rights, forest resources, and this kind of thing, and then use these maps to defend their lands and to influence broader reform processes around forests and land rights. Another key flagship program for us is our Forest Link system, which again is a real-time forest monitoring system where communities can send real-time alerts on illegal logging or human rights abuses in forests through a dedicated system, even in areas where there's no telecommunications infrastructure. So it's all about, in a nutshell, it's about trying to bridge the gap between very remote and disenfranchised communities with the broader processes that affect their lives and the forest that they inhabit.
So what's your broad level take on how the world's rainforests fared in 2020, and how do Africa's rainforests specifically fit into those trends?
I think 2020 has been a bit of a mixed bag for rainforests. The pandemic has certainly led to greater awareness of the interdependence of humans and nature, and in many areas we've seen a decrease in deforestation. But at the same time, I think while the eyes of the world have been focused elsewhere, we have seen an uptick in illegal deforestation in other areas. For example, there's been some really worrying land incursions on indigenous Brazilian territories in the Amazon. In many parts of the DR Congo, we've seen an uptick in illegal logging.
By the DR Congo, Eisen, of course, means the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Central African country that is home to about half of the remaining tropical forests in the Congo Basin.
But I think the impacts of the pandemic have been particularly acute on the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, many of whom are more susceptible to respiratory illnesses. On the face of it, the impacts don't seem to have been as severe in Africa, although that might be partially at least due to lack of testing capacity and healthcare capacity in rainforest areas. But I would like just to give a quick shout out to our partners who have done some incredible work this year in getting COVID awareness and relief into rainforest areas. And although many of the groups that we work with are going to be at the very back of the queue for vaccinations, there's some really inspiring work happening on the ground. Aside from COVID, I would like to think that 2020 was the year where the global international biodiversity kind of community finally recognized that the conventional approaches to protecting rainforests, which in Central Africa are strictly protected areas, or otherwise known as the fortress conservation approach, is no longer fit for purpose, and and that we need to find new approaches which place local and indigenous communities at the heart of them.
Did the COVID pandemic cause a lot of people to leave cities in the Congo Basin and sort of flee to rural areas? And might this impact rainforests? Or are there any pandemic recovery policies adopted by countries that might have an impact on forests?
There has, in some countries, we have noted there has been an exodus from capital cities into rural areas as COVID took hold in parts of Africa. For example, in Cameroon, a lot of city dwellers returned to their native villages, or to villages where there were shaman that could provide support to them. So there has been a notable trend in that respect. I think it hasn't been the impacts so far haven't been as acute in Africa as they have been in the Amazon, but it has impacted local economies for sure. And I think while it's fared better, new strains that are emerging in South Africa, for example, do raise serious concern about its impact in the forests of Central Africa. I think government support has been extremely limited. I think healthcare provision in rural rainforest areas is practically zero, and I guess it's definitely one to watch in 2021, and of course African citizens are very likely to be at the back of the queue for vaccines.
You mentioned that there's growing recognition of the failures of fortress conservation in the Congo rainforest. Can you tell us a bit more about what fortress conservation has looked like there and what alternatives are starting to appear, like rights-based approaches?
Well, the dominant paradigm of forest management in the Congo Basin over the past 30 or so years has very much been around supporting so-called sustainable forest management, or otherwise known as industrial logging, with concessions accounting for around about 40% of the region's forests. At the same time, there's been significant support for the creation and management of strictly protected areas in the region as well. But I think there's a growing realization that indigenous forest communities have very much been squeezed by these two approaches and are essentially landless in many respects. And despite the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been poured into this model over the years, we're seeing very little change in social conditions. We're seeing resource conflict, and we're not seeing particularly good outcomes for biodiversity either. It's important to make a distinction between the kinds of protected areas you find in the Amazon and those that are prevalent in the Congo Basin, for example. Whereas a lot of those in the Amazon are essentially indigenous lands. In Africa, what you see is primarily a fortress conservation model. So the idea that these forests are wildernesses untouched by humans and should be protected as such. But one of the things that we do as an organization is we, through our Mapping for Rights program, is provide communities with geospatial technologies which allow them to map their customary lands and resources in forests. And what this has shown is that there's essentially very few parts of the African rainforest that isn't used or claimed under customary systems. However, the protected area model that prevails is very much one around wilderness. So what you find is that protected areas are often created without consultation of local and indigenous communities who live and depend on this land. This then leads to problems in terms of accessing land and resources and livelihoods. A few years ago, we looked. We through our projects on the ground, we noticed that there were a lot of very negative social impacts for local communities, and we got the money together to look into this issue more systematically in 2016, and we conducted a joint study with the University of Helsinki into 32 protected areas across 5 countries in the region. And what it found was that in the vast majority of them, there were physical and economic displacements of local people. There were human rights abuses by armed rangers. all sorts of very, very kind of negative impacts. But also interesting, what we found and what we didn't expect to find was that these protected areas weren't being particularly effective in conserving biodiversity, with keystone species in decline and other indicators not faring very well either. So we produced this study, and at the time there was a lot of resistance to this. That, how could protected areas not be serving this purpose? And there was lots of pushback from governments, from international donors, from large conservation agencies. And I guess it really came into the public consciousness in 2019, 2020, when BuzzFeed published a series of exposés around human rights abuses of local communities.
Back in October of 2019, we featured Katie Baker right here on the Manga Bay Newscast. She's one of the BuzzFeed reporters that broke these stories about abuses of local communities in African protected areas by park rangers. You can check that episode out if you want to know more.
And since then, we are sensing a step change in that the international community and the donor community are starting to understand now that you can't separate forests and peoples, and that the best chance we have of saving the African rainforests is by developing integrated approaches which recognise the rights of the people that inhabit them. So we're kind of entering a very interesting period now, where the business as usual scenario is no longer acceptable. And of course, the battle is on to try and develop new community-based approaches, which, as we've seen in the Amazon, tend to deliver much better conservation outcomes, but also much better social outcomes as well. So looking forward in terms of important events this year, as we know, countries around the world are in the process of negotiating the post-2020 biodiversity framework, which will set the stage for international biodiversity conservation over the coming decade. And one of the most controversial aspects or proposals that is being debated is a target to essentially double the globally protected area from around 15 to 30% within the next decade. And it's really important that that we don't see a replication of these fortress conservation models which disempower local indigenous communities, and that we start to promote these rights-based approaches for the betterment of the rainforests and the people that live in them.
Tell us a little bit more about those approaches.
So in recent years, there has been some really important legal developments. In each of the Congo Basin countries, there's now legislation for community forests. And in a region where land is state-owned, this gives provides the best pathway for supporting communities to realise their collective rights to their customary forests. In the DR Congo, hopefully this year we'll see a new Indigenous Peoples Law, and that follows a similar law that we supported in the Republic of Congo. There's also very positive legal developments on community rights in places such as the Central African Republic as well. So I think the challenge now that we have the legislation in place, is to think about how we can mainstream these approaches. There is, some funding going towards community forest development and the like, but it still pales in comparison to what is going towards supporting these protected areas and subsidizing industrial logging companies.
What are some of the so-called nature-based solutions that are emerging that might be in play in 2021, and what positives do they have, as well as what risks?
I think we're entering a really crucial period in terms of global efforts on rainforests and climate. As I said, with the negotiation of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and of course with countries due to revise their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Climate Accord. It's really great to see a ramping up of ambition from a number of countries, and we're seeing this with the various carbon net zero commitments from countries and large companies as well. However, we do see some risks around these net carbon zero commitments, in the sense that to what extent are they achievable through reductions in fossil fuel emissions in the global north, and to what extent are we going to see a proliferation of forest carbon offsetting schemes in the Congo Basin, and throughout the world. So I'll give the example, the aviation industry is putting in place its Corsia offset scheme, which it wants to use as a means of continuing the growth of the aviation industry. So I think what we're going to see over the coming year and decade is these forest offset projects, and we see this as being risky on a number of different levels. I mean, firstly, it delays much needed climate action in the global north, and places the burden on those that are least responsible for the climate crisis to reduce their impact on forests. What we found from more than a decade of RED in rainforests is that such offset schemes are particularly unlikely to deliver equitable and sustainable outcomes in contexts where there's no communal land rights, in the sense that other private sector actors, so private RED projects, industrial logging companies, so on and so forth, are likely to be better positioned to benefit from these payments than forest dwellers. And of course, we also have concerns around carbon accounting. So, if, for example, despite more than a decade of so-called RED readiness in rainforest areas, there's still lots of problems in terms of accounting carbon, inflated baselines, leakage, what additionality these kind of offset projects actually give. And I know, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on setting up a global system of carbon trading is still in process, but we see lots of risk with this approach.
Community forest legislation being adopted by Congo rainforest countries is certainly a bright spot, but there's at least one case in Liberia last year where the government just basically ignored a community's legal rights to its land in order to allow a mining company to start operating on their land. What should we make of that? What's the lesson to be learned, if any, from that example?
Of course, community forests in themselves aren't a silver bullet solution. They need to be accompanied by robust institutions, both within communities and in forest administrations. They need to deliver benefits for communities in terms of accessing sustainable markets. There's no quick fix to this stuff. We're talking about a generational shift here, and the kind of investment that's gone into industrial logging, for example, to get community forest as a mainstream forest management tool in the long term. I also think something that's key to this is how can we integrate community forests into a broader system of participatory land use planning. Historically, what we've seen in the Congo Basin is the various sectors such as forests, agriculture, mining, kind of being planned in isolation with one another, all often superimposed over a mostly unrecognized system of customary rights and resources of local communities. So I think taking advantage of some of the new tools, such as our Mapping for Rights program, which allows communities to map and plan their own lands, and integrating these into broader national and subnational processes really holds the key here.
Norway is funding new satellite monitoring this year. Do you expect that to help local communities in the Congo to secure their lands?
So there's been some really excellent advances in satellite monitoring. Firstly with the stuff that the Global Forest Watch has done, and now with these really high resolution satellites that we're going to be able to access through Norway funding. I think it's really, really, really good in seeing where deforestation is happening. But of course, up in the sky, it doesn't tell us why deforestation is happening and who's responsible for it. So I think as an organization, one of the things that we've been doing over the past few years is to develop community forest monitoring systems. Our system is called ForestLink, and it essentially allows communities, even in remote areas with no telecommunications infrastructure, to send real-time illegal logging alerts to the authorities, to local NGOs, and in some cases to the international community. So I think it's really important to combine the bird's eye view from the satellite monitoring with these bottom up approaches, empowering local communities to monitor and track what's happening in their forests and to ground truth, the alerts that are coming from these satellites. I think these new Norway funded satellites are really interesting, but they need to be integrated into law enforcement and rights-based approaches as well for them to really feel the true potential.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. If you know someone who's particularly interested in rainforests, this would be a perfect episode to share with them. You and your friend can subscribe to the Manga Bay Newscast on the Google Podcasts app, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Pandora, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also download our new app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Grecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.